Hey, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Chapter 1. The Forced Marriage. On a late autumn afternoon, the fading sunlight filtered through the large glass windows of the Knight mansion, casting a warm, pale golden glow over the living room. Yet it wasn't enough to dispel the heavy atmosphere that enveloped the space. Mrs. Margaret Knight, a noblewoman with snow-white hair, sat in a red velvet armchair, her frail, trembling hands gripping a cane tightly. Her eyes, clouded by age, still shone with determination as she gazed at the two young people before her. Her grandson, Alexander Knight, and Elena Walker, a girl she cherished like her own flesh and blood. Margaret had been battling heart disease for years, but recently the doctor had told her that her time was running out. Her voice was weak but resolute as she broke the tense silence. Alexander, I know you don't like this, but I have one final wish before I close my eyes. I want to see you marry Elena. She's a good girl, and I believe she'll bring you happiness. Alexander, a tall man with an icy demeanor like a statue carved from frost, leaned against the window frame. His piercing blue eyes didn't turn toward his grandmother, but remained fixed on Elena. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he exuded the power and arrogance of a CEO at the helm of Knight Enterprises. His thin lips pressed into a tight line as he replied in a low, gravelly voice, barely concealing his reluctance. Grandmother, I respect you, but I can't promise to love her. If you want me to marry her to put your mind at ease, I'll do it. But that's all. Elena sat across from him on the sofa, her hands resting gently in her lap. At 25, she was strikingly beautiful, with soft brown hair and clear brown eyes, though her face now betrayed a hint of tension. Raised in poverty and orphaned at a young age, Elena owed her survival to Margaret's kindness. Her sponsorship of Elena's art studies and occasional financial support had kept her afloat through the hardest times. Her gratitude toward Margaret was the only reason Elena had agreed to this marriage, despite knowing full well that Alexander Knight despised her to his very core. Margaret turned to Elena, her gaze tender, yet laced with worry. Elena, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, she said, her voice trembling. But I truly believe you and Alexander could find happiness together. Elena took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. She knew what Alexander thought of her, that she was a traitor, a beautiful but scheming girl who had destroyed Ethan Scott, his best friend, and was now exploiting Margaret's affection to worm her way into the wealthy Knight family. The truth was entirely different, but Elena had never defended herself. She believed words couldn't undo a trust warped by pain and loss. Mrs. Margaret, if this is what you want, I'll agree, Elena replied, her voice soft but firm. I just want you to be at peace. Margaret gave a faint smile, tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. But that smile quickly faded as Alexander stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor. He stopped in front of Elena, towering and imposing, looking down at her with a gaze of contempt, as if she were a stain on the family's expensive rug. Don't expect me to love you, he said, his voice as cold as ice, each word sharp like a blade. A traitor like you doesn't deserve love. The room fell into a deathly silence. Margaret let out a shaky breath, clutching her chest, but she was too weak to protest. The servants nearby kept their heads bowed, not daring to look up. Alexander turned to leave, but Elena's voice cut through the stifling air. She didn't lower her head or tremble as he might have expected. Instead, Elena lifted her face, her brown eyes meeting his icy stare head-on. Her hands gripped the edge of her skirt until her knuckles turned white, but her voice was eerily calm, carrying a subtle undertone. You think you know everything about me? Then go ahead and hold on to that hatred. Alexander froze, if only for a fleeting moment. Her words pierced his arrogant exterior like a tiny dagger, causing a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. What was she hinting at? Did she think she could play mind games with him? But he quickly regained his composure, his lips curling into a mocking smirk. You're quite the actress, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But don't think those words will change anything. The wedding will take place this weekend. Be ready. He turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving Elena with a heavy heart and Margaret with silent anguish. Yet in Alexander's mind, Elena's words lingered, a tiny seed of doubt he couldn't shake. What was she hiding? And why had she dared to look him in the eye and say that? Margaret reached for Elena's hand, whispering, "Be patient with him, dear. He's just hurting." Elena nodded, but deep down she knew. This marriage wasn't just a sacrifice to please Margaret. It was a trial she wasn't sure she could endure. Before her stood a man who didn't just hate her, but believed she was the cause of his best friend's death. And now she was about to become his wife, an unwanted, unloved wife. As the last light of dusk faded beyond the windows, Elena stood and stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the cold evening air. She gazed down at the sprawling gardens of the Knight estate, wondering if she could find any light in the darkness ahead. But deep within, she knew this was only the beginning of a journey filled with pain and mystery, a journey neither she nor Alexander was ready to face. Chapter 2. A Painful Past and Misunderstandings. 5 years ago, the city was drenched in rain for an entire month. The narrow cobblestone streets of the old neighborhood where Elena lived were covered with puddles that glimmered under the dim yellow streetlights. She was just 20 then, a young girl with sparkling brown eyes and a dream of becoming an artist. Life hadn't been kind to Elena. Orphaned as a child, she worked odd jobs to pay for her tuition and the rent of a rundown apartment. But everything brightened when she met Ethan Scott, a 25-year-old with a warm smile and a deep, captivating voice. Ethan was a talented engineer and Alexander Knight's best friend from college. He entered Elena's life like sunshine after a storm, bringing joy and hope. They met by chance at a small art exhibition Elena had organized to sell her paintings for extra money. Ethan bought her first piece, a painting of a flower field under a gray sky, and from there, they grew closer. He'd often stop by her apartment in the evenings, bringing sandwiches and funny stories about his job. For the first time in her life, Elena felt she wasn't alone. Their love blossomed quickly, deeply, and sincerely, at least in Elena's eyes. She loved Ethan with all the innocence of her heart. Whether he held her hand as they walked in the rain or sat quietly beside her in her tiny room. Watching her paint, Elena believed he was the man she'd spend her life with. She dreamed of a simple wedding, a small house with a flower-filled garden, and afternoons spent painting or storytelling with their children. But that dream shattered on a cold, rainy night she'd never forget. It was an evening when Elena decided to surprise Ethan at his apartment, carrying a newly finished painting as an early birthday gift. She stood at his door, her raincoat soaked, her heart pounding with excitement. But when the door opened, Ethan wasn't alone. Another woman, tall, beautiful, with golden hair and a confident smile, clung to his arm. Ethan, panic-stricken, stammered, "Elena, it's not what you think." But she'd seen enough. The canvas bag in her hand dropped to the floor, the painting inside tumbling out, distorted by the rainwater dripping from her coat. She didn't scream or cry. She simply turned and walked into the freezing rain. Ethan ran after her, calling her name, but Elena didn't stop. His voice faded beneath the sound of the downpour, and she knew in that moment everything between them was over. The next day, Elena sent Ethan a single message. "Don't look for me anymore. We're done." She locked her apartment door, turned off her phone, and cried until she was exhausted beside her unfinished paintings. She told no one of her pain, wanting neither pity nor comfort. To Elena, her first love had died, leaving a deep scar she tried to bury. But the story didn't end there. 2 days after their breakup, Ethan, drunk and distraught, crashed his car into a roadside tree and died instantly. The news reached Alexander Knight first, as Ethan's closest friend, the one who'd seen him as a brother. Alexander arrived at the scene, staring at the wrecked car and Ethan's body being taken away. He didn't cry, but his fists clenched tight, his eyes red with grief and rage. One question burned in his mind. Why had Ethan ended up like this? Alexander began digging. He went through Ethan's phone and found Elena's final message. "Don't look for me anymore. We're done." He spoke to mutual friends who said Ethan had been drinking heavily after Elena ended things. No one knew exactly what had happened between them, but Alexander didn't need more proof. He concluded that Elena, The beautiful, impoverished girl Ethan had loved, had abandoned his friend for money or ambition, driving Ethan to despair in his tragic death. In Alexander's eyes, Elena became a manipulative, greedy woman who used her beauty to exploit others. He recalled how Ethan used to talk about her with shining eyes, and he told himself she'd deceived both Ethan and their friendship. The pain of losing his best friend turned into a smoldering hatred that burned in Alexander's heart for 5 long years. He swore he'd never forgive her, never let her hurt anyone else. But Alexander didn't know the truth. He didn't know Ethan had betrayed Elena first, that she'd ended things in agony, not out of greed or ambition. He didn't know that on the night Ethan died, Elena was curled up in her apartment, crying until she had no tears left, blaming herself for not being enough to keep him. She didn't learn of the accident until days later, when a mutual friend told her with a voice full of sympathy. Elena only nodded silently, offering no explanation or defense. She chose to bury that past, letting it rest with Ethan in his cold grave. Time passed, and Elena carried on, painting and teaching art to street children to numb her pain. She met Mrs. Margaret Knight by chance at a charity event, and the older woman's kindness pulled her from the darkness. But fate had a cruel twist. Margaret was Alexander's grandmother, the man who now saw her as an irreconcilable enemy. Meanwhile, Alexander built his business empire with an iron hand and a frozen heart. He loved no one, trusted no one, and his hatred for Elena grew when he saw her near his grandmother. He believed she was exploiting Margaret's affection to infiltrate the Knight family, chasing the wealth she'd supposedly dreamed of when she abandoned Ethan. He never doubted the narrative he'd constructed, and he vowed to make her pay if she dared step into his world. That painful past, layered with misunderstandings, laid the foundation for the stormy marriage to come. Elena carried the scar of betrayal, while Alexander bore an unquenchable flame of hatred. 2 wounded souls, 2 broken hearts, forced into a bond either desired, a beginning marked by suffering and secrets yet to be unveiled. Chapter 3. Elena's Painful Marriage. The wedding of Elena Walker and Alexander Knight took place on a frigid early winter morning at the city's oldest church. There were no vibrant fresh flowers, no bursts of laughter, only the curious gazes of the guests in a heavy atmosphere that hung over the scene. Elena wore a simple white wedding dress chosen by Mrs. Margaret, her trembling hands clutching a bouquet of white carnations, Margaret's favorite flower. Alexander, clad in a sleek black suit, stood beside her like an ice statue, offering no smile, no hand to hold, reciting his vows to the priest in a low, emotionless tone. When the priest declared them husband and wife, he didn't even kiss her. He simply turned away, leaving Elena standing there with hollow eyes and a burdened heart. After the ceremony, they moved into the Knight Mansion, a sprawling estate with endless corridors and lavish but cold rooms. Elena held a faint hope that living together might soften Alexander's hatred, even just a little. But she soon realized it was a delusion. Alexander treated her like an invisible ghost in his own home. He never called her by name, never met her eyes, and when he had to speak to her, his words were curt and icy. "What are you doing here?" Or, "Don't bother me." In the early days after the wedding, Elena tried to fit in. She woke up early to prepare breakfast, hoping they could sit together like a normal couple. One morning she made toast and sunny-side-up eggs, setting them on the dining table with a flicker of anticipation. But when Alexander entered the room, he glanced at the plate, smirked mockingly, and said, "You think these little tricks will soften me? Don't pretend to be kind. I don't need it." He pulled out his chair and left without touching a bite, leaving Elena standing there, her hands gripping the table's edge until they turned pale. The household staff, silent figures who always kept their heads bowed, looked at her with pity, but no one dared speak. Alexander's coldness didn't end there. He frequently mocked and insulted her in front of others, as if to remind her she didn't belong. One evening, when Elena accidentally dropped a glass in the kitchen, the sharp sound of it shattering drew Alexander's attention from the nearby living room, where he'd been reading the newspaper. He walked in, glanced at the broken pieces on the floor, then fixed her with a look of contempt. "You're truly useless. Can't even hold a glass properly. I don't know why grandmother chose someone like you." Elena bent down to pick up the shards, her hands trembling, but she didn't reply. She'd learned that arguing only fueled his anger, and silence was her only shield for the scraps of dignity she had left. Alexander saw every kind act from Elena as a facade. One late night, when she brought tea to his study, hoping to ease his tension after work, he shoved the tray aside, his voice cutting. "What do you want? Money? Attention? Don't think these cheap tricks will fool me. I know exactly who you are." Elena bowed her head silently and left, but inside a storm of emotions raged. Hurt, frustration, and helplessness. He didn't know she did these things not to win him over, but to honor her promise to Margaret, to try and keep this marriage from becoming a complete hell. Margaret was the only light in Elena's dark days. Though her health was fading, she often called Elena to her room for private talks. In the afternoons, as faint sunlight streamed through the window, Elena sat by her bedside, listening to Margaret recount tales of her youth and the happy years with Alexander's grandfather. Holding Elena's hand with her frail but warm grasp, Margaret spoke gently. "I know Alexander's difficult, but he's not a bad person. He's just blinded by pain. Be patient with him, will you? I believe you can change him." Elena nodded, smiling to ease Margaret's mind, but inside she knew her patience was wearing thin. Margaret was her sole comfort, the only one in this house who saw her true self, not the distorted image Alexander had painted. Yet even Margaret's love couldn't heal the deepening wounds in Elena's heart. She began to feel suffocated in the vast mansion. Each time she walked the halls, she caught the servants' whispers, not malicious, but laced with sympathy for the unloved bride. Each time she saw Alexander, she felt the invisible wall between them, towering, frigid, and impenetrable. To escape the pain, Elena turned to her art studio, a small room in a corner of the mansion that Margaret had set aside for her. Every night when the house fell silent, she retreated there, sitting before her easel with brushes and colors. She painted emotion-filled canvases, flower fields under gray skies, endless rainy streets, and sometimes the faint silhouette of a man she once loved. Those brushstrokes weren't just art. They were her way of soothing a bleeding heart. Some nights she cried silently, tears falling onto the canvas, blurring the careful lines of color. One time while painting, Elena heard footsteps at the door. Startled, she turned to find Alexander standing there, his piercing blue eyes fixed on the canvas, a painting of a faceless man standing in the rain. He was silent for a moment, then sneered. "Is that Ethan, or some other fool you used? Pathetic, clinging to the past like this?" Elena gripped her brush tightly, a stab of pain piercing her chest, but she didn't respond. She knew he wouldn't believe anything she said, and she was too exhausted to try explaining. Alexander turned and left, leaving her with the unfinished painting and a growing loneliness. As the months passed, Elena became a shadow in the night mansion. She cared for Margaret and fulfilled her role as a wife in name only, but her heart grew weary. She wondered how long she could endure this marriage, one without love, without hope, filled only with hatred and unhealed wounds. Margaret kept urging patience, but Elena began to feel that patience was turning her into someone she didn't recognize. Weak, resigned, and stripped of the light that once shone in her eyes. One night, standing before her easel, Elena gazed at her latest painting, a girl in a flower field, her back turned to the world. She whispered to herself, "How much longer can I keep going like this?" There was no answer, only the cold wind whistling through the window crack, carrying the chill of winter and the quiet ache in her heart. Chapter 4. The Climax of Conflict. Spring arrived at the night mansion, bringing warm breezes and the blooming fragrance of jasmine in the expansive garden. But in Elena's heart, there was no spring, only an endless winter that stretched on without reprieve. 6 months into her marriage with Alexander, their relationship remained unchanged. He maintained his cold, distant demeanor, occasionally lashing out with sharp, mocking words that cut into her like a knife. Elena endured, not because she still hoped to change him, but for Margaret, the woman whose heart condition worsened by the day, yet who remained the sole light in Elena's life. The tension began to escalate one early April morning when Alexander stumbled upon a bank transfer receipt in his grandmother's office. It was a substantial sum, labeled Support for Elena Walker, drawn from Margaret's personal account. Alexander gripped the paper tightly, a cold fury flashing in his deep blue eyes. He needed no further proof. In his mind, everything was crystal clear. Elena, the woman he'd always suspected, was exploiting his grandmother's affection to siphon the family's wealth. He didn't know the truth was entirely different. In reality, Margaret, in her final months, had repeatedly tried to send money to Elena to support her charitable work teaching art to underprivileged children. She knew Elena lived frugally and always refused help, but Margaret wanted to do something for the granddaughter-in-law she cherished. Each time Elena received the funds, she quietly instructed Margaret's private lawyer, Henry Grayson, to redirect every cent to the Knight family's charity fund, keeping nothing for herself. She didn't want Alexander to misunderstand, but she also didn't tell him, knowing he'd never believe her no matter how she explained. Alexander, with hatred deeply rooted in his mind, didn't bother to investigate further. Clutching the receipt, a scornful smirk twisted his angular face. "She's a venomous snake," he muttered to himself, "beautiful on the outside, vicious within." He resolved to confront Elena, but not immediately. He wanted to wait for the perfect moment to expose her in front of everyone, leaving her no room to deny it. That opportunity came at a family gathering held at the Knight Mansion over the weekend. It was Margaret's 80th birthday, a rare occasion she still had the strength to attend. The guests included distant relatives, close family friends, and a few of Alexander's key business partners. The mansion was adorned extravagantly. Crystal chandeliers glittered from the ceiling. A long banquet table draped in white silk held an array of exquisite dishes, and soft orchestral music floated from a live ensemble in the corner. Margaret sat at the center, frail but smiling, her eyes glowing with joy at seeing everyone gathered. Elena wore a simple emerald green gown, her hair neatly pinned in a low bun, trying to blend into the atmosphere. She stood by Margaret, helping her cut the birthday cake and chatting with elderly guests. Though her heart was heavy, she kept a gentle smile, not wanting to worry Margaret. Alexander, dressed in a dark gray suit, stood across the banquet hall, a glass of red wine in hand, his icy gaze fixed on Elena. He watched her every move, and in his mind, each gesture was a pretense, a performance designed to win over his grandmother and deceive everyone else. The evening proceeded peacefully until Margaret, with a frail voice, asked everyone to raise a toast. Holding Elena's hand, she addressed the room. "I'm so happy to have Elena here. She's the greatest gift I've received in my final days. Thank you, Elena, for being there for me and Alexander." Applause broke out, but Alexander suddenly slammed his wine glass onto the table, the sharp clink startling everyone into turning toward him. He strode to the center of the room, his eyes like ice, his low, commanding voice resonating. "Grandmother, I'm sorry to say this on your happy day, but I can't let everyone keep being fooled by a fraud like her." Elena froze, her hand still clasped in Margaret's, a chill racing down her spine. Margaret frowned, about to speak, but Alexander raised the receipt for all to see, his voice cutting like a blade. "This woman, Elena Walker, has been secretly taking money from my grandmother, a large sum which she pretends to use for a humble life, all while scheming to steal the Knight family fortune. She's a shameless gold digger, a snake in the guise of a good person." The room fell into a deathly silence. Eyes turned to Elena, some curious, some shocked, others whispering with suspicion. Margaret gasped, clutching her chest, her wide eyes fixed on Alexander. "Alexander, what are you saying? Elena would never—" But he interrupted, his tone growing harsher. "Grandmother, she's deceived you. I have proof right here. She doesn't deserve your love or a place in this house." Elena stood there as if frozen in a storm of accusations. She felt every piercing stare, every murmur like a needle in her heart. She wanted to explain, to say she'd never kept the money, that she'd had Grayson redirect it all, but her throat tightened and no words came. She looked at Alexander, his eyes glinting with triumph and contempt, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to crush her. Margaret struggled to stand, her voice trembling. "Alexander, enough! You don't understand anything?" But her strength failed her. and she collapsed back into her chair, breathing heavily. Elena rushed to support her, tears welling up, not from Alexander's insults, but from not wanting Margaret to suffer because of her. She whispered, "Grandmother, don't worry, I'm fine." But Alexander didn't relent. He stepped closer to Elena, glaring down at her with unrestrained fury. "You dare keep pretending? You think tears will make people believe you? I said from the start, you don't belong in this family. You're just a greedy leech who destroyed Ethan and now my grandmother." That was the final straw. Elena felt her heart shatter, not from the humiliation, but from realizing that no matter how hard she tried, Alexander would never see who she truly was. She released Margaret's hand, stood tall, her tear-filled eyes steady. She said nothing, offered no defense, and simply turned to walk out of the banquet hall. Her footsteps echoed evenly on the wooden floor, a silent farewell. People watched her go. Some whispered, others stayed quiet. Margaret called after her in desperation, "Elena, come back." But she didn't stop. She stepped onto the veranda, where the spring breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine, and stood there, staring into the darkness. A final tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't sob. She only told herself, "I can't keep doing this." Inside the banquet hall, Alexander stood, his breathing still heavy with anger. He thought he'd won, that he'd exposed Elena's true nature. But as he saw Margaret clutching her chest, tears streaming down her face, a strange void opened in his chest. Not the satisfaction he'd expected, but an unsettling unease. That night, Elena didn't return to her bedroom. She sat in her art studio, gazing at her unfinished paintings, wondering if she had the strength to keep enduring. The climax of their conflict had arrived, and it didn't just fracture the fragile bond between her and Alexander. It pushed her to the brink of despair. Chapter 5. The Turning Point. Elena Leaves. Spring gave way to the sweltering days of summer at the Knight Mansion. The atmosphere in the vast house grew even heavier as Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly after the tumultuous birthday celebration. The heart disease that had tormented her for years had become an unbeatable foe. She lay in her large bedroom, the windows wide open to let in a faint breeze from the garden, but her eyes, once radiant with love, were now clouded and weary. Elena stayed by her side almost constantly, holding her hand, reading books, or sharing stories about the paintings she'd once created. She knew Margaret's time was running out, and every moment with her was a precious gift she didn't want to lose. Alexander, despite his usual cold demeanor, couldn't deny the ache in his chest as he watched his grandmother weaken. He often lingered outside her room, peering through the crack in the door, seeing Elena gently wipe Margaret's brow or whisper words of comfort. But instead of feeling touched, it only fueled his anger. To him, she remained a fraud, exploiting Margaret's affection even as the older woman neared her end. He couldn't stand the thought that Elena would continue playing the perfect wife after Margaret's death, living in this house as if she belonged. The day Margaret took her final breath arrived on a drizzly afternoon. Elena was sitting by the bed, clutching Margaret's hand, when the older woman opened her eyes one last time. With the little strength she had left, she whispered, "Elena, don't give up on Alexander. Promise me?" Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't bring herself to voice the promise. Margaret gave a faint smile, then her hand slipped from Elena's grasp, falling onto the white blanket. The sound of rain outside drowned out Elena's choked sob. Margaret was gone, leaving her with a grief and emptiness beyond words. Alexander was summoned shortly after. He entered the room, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Seeing his grandmother lying still, her eyes closed forever, he froze, his fists clenching tightly. He didn't cry. He'd never let anyone see him vulnerable, but his eyes reddened and his breathing grew heavy. Elena stood to leave, intending to give him space with Margaret, but he suddenly turned to her, his voice trembling with pain and rage. "Are you satisfied now? Grandmother's dead. You don't have to pretend anymore." Elena halted, her tearful eyes meeting his. She wanted to say she genuinely loved Margaret, that she was the only one who'd made her feel accepted in this house, but she knew he wouldn't believe her. She bowed her head silently, about to walk away, but Alexander didn't stop. The agony of losing Margaret, the most important person in his life, mingled with his hatred for Elena, erupting into an uncontrollable storm. He shouted, his voice breaking, "You're the reason she got weaker. You stayed here pretending to care, but it was all for money to take over my family. You think I don't know? Get out of my house right now. I don't want to see your face for another second." His words stabbed into Elena's heart like a blade. She stood there trembling, not from fear but from pain and helplessness. She looked at Alexander, his eyes bloodshot, his face contorted with grief and fury. She knew he was unloading everything onto her, but she had no strength left to fight back. 6 months of living with his hatred, humiliation, and loneliness had worn her down to nothing. She whispered, her voice soft but resolute, "If that's what you want, I'll go." Alexander didn't reply, turning his face away, his hands shaking as he clutched his head. Elena walked out of the room, tears streaming down her face, but she made no sound. She passed through the long hallway, once filled with Margaret's laughter, where she'd once hoped to someday call home. Now it was just a prison she needed to escape. That night, Elena didn't sleep. She sat in her art studio, the faint yellow light illuminating her unfinished paintings. She took a blank sheet of paper and wrote a few shaky lines. "I'll set you free. Please live well." She placed the note beside a signed divorce petition, then packed a small suitcase with a few simple clothes, a box of paints, and her favorite brush. She took nothing from the Knight family. No money, no jewelry, not even the wedding dress Margaret had given her. She wanted to leave as her true self, unburdened by anything from this place. At the first light of dawn, Elena stepped out of the Knight mansion. The rain had stopped, leaving shimmering puddles on the stone path. She paused one last time, looking up at Margaret's window, and whispered, "I'm sorry, grandmother. I couldn't keep my promise." Then she turned, dragging her small suitcase behind her, and walked into the misty road ahead. She had no clear plan, no idea where she'd go, but she knew she had to leave, away from Alexander, away from the pain that had held her captive too long. Elena vanished from the city that very day. She left no phone number, no contact with anyone she'd known at the Knight mansion. She severed every tie, as if erasing her existence from Alexander's life. No one knew where she'd gone. The servants whispered among themselves about the mistress who left, but none dared ask Alexander, who, since Margaret's death, had grown more silent and withdrawn than ever. In the days that followed, Alexander sank into grief and his own turmoil. Margaret's funeral was simple, attended only by a few relatives and close friends. He stood before her grave, his eyes empty, saying nothing. Returning home, he found Elena's note and divorce petition on the table in her studio, along with a file documenting every instance she'd redirected Margaret's money back to the family's charity fund. He picked up the paper, reading each word, and for the first time since she'd left, he felt an odd void in his chest. Not the relief he'd expected, but an inexplicable emptiness. He threw the note to the floor, telling himself this was what he wanted. Elena was gone, and he was finally rid of her. But as he walked through the hallway, he heard echoes of the days when Margaret was alive. Her laughter with Elena, the gentle sound of Elena's voice caring for her. He stopped at the studio, gazing at the paintings she'd left behind. Flower fields, rainy streets, and an unfinished piece of a woman walking away. For reasons he couldn't name, his hands clenched, and a quiet unease crept into his heart. Elena was gone, taking her pain and silence with her. But she'd also left behind an Alexander no longer certain of what he'd once believed. The vast house now stood eerily quiet, and in that stillness, he began to feel a small crack in the wall of hatred he'd built over 5 years, a crack he wasn't ready to confront. Chapter 6. The Truth Revealed. Alexander's Late Awakening. A year had passed since Elena left the Knight mansion. Autumn returned, bringing cool breezes and golden leaves that fell sparsely along the path leading to the city cemetery. It was the 6th anniversary of Ethan Scott's death, Alexander's best friend, the one he'd always believed Elena had destroyed. As he did every year, Alexander visited the cemetery alone, carrying a bouquet of white daisies, Ethan's favorite flower, and an expensive bottle of whiskey they'd once shared in happier times. The cemetery was quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the rows of headstones and Alexander's steady footsteps breaking the silence. He stopped at Ethan's grave, placed the flowers down, and sat on the dry grass, leaning against the cold stone. He opened the whiskey, poured a little onto the ground as a greeting, then took a sip, letting the sharp burn spread through his throat. His deep blue eyes traced the inscription on the headstone: Ethan Scott, 1990 to 2020, and memories of old times flooded back. Late nights drinking in their college dorm, Ethan's glowing eyes as he spoke of the girl he loved, and the fateful day Alexander received news of his death in a car accident. Alexander whispered, his voice low, "You still owe me a basketball game, you idiot! How could you leave me like this?" He gave a faint smile, but it quickly faded as Elena's image flashed through his mind. He still believed she was the reason for Ethan's death, a conviction that had become an unshakable truth in his heart for 5 years. The fuel for the hatred that drove him to treat her cruelly throughout their brief marriage. Yet since the day she'd left, leaving behind her note and divorce papers, he couldn't deny a strange emptiness clinging to him, as if there was something he'd overlooked. Lost in thought, a gentle voice interrupted from behind. "You're Alexander Knight, aren't you?" Alexander turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw a young woman standing a few steps away. She had shoulder-length golden hair, pale blue eyes, and a delicate face tinged with a hint of sadness. He recognized her instantly. Sarah Miller, an old college acquaintance he and Ethan had known. But what startled him was her presence here, on Ethan's Memorial Day, holding a small bouquet of violets. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "What are you doing here?" Sarah offered a faint smile, stepping forward to place her flowers beside Alexander's daisies. She sat down next to him without hesitation and replied, "I came to visit Ethan. It's his Memorial Day. I couldn't not come." Alexander frowned, a sense of confusion rising within him. He knew Sarah had been their friend, but he didn't recall her being close enough to Ethan to visit annually. He asked, his tone cold, "Since when were you and Ethan close? I don't remember him mentioning you much." Sarah looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, then sighed, lowering her gaze to the violets in her hands. After a moment of silence, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I'm not surprised you don't know. Ethan didn't want anyone to know, especially you. I was his girlfriend, before he died." Alexander froze, the glass of whiskey nearly slipping from his hand. He stared at Sarah, his mind reeling, struggling to process what he'd just heard. "Ethan's girlfriend?" he repeated, his voice laced with doubt. "That's impossible. Ethan loved Elena Walker. She was the only one he ever talked to me about." Sarah looked up, her eyes shimmering with pain and a touch of anger. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Elena wasn't the last person in Ethan's heart. I was. You don't know the truth because Ethan never told you, and I didn't want to speak up. Until today." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. He set the glass down, leaning toward Sarah, his voice hardening. "What are you saying? Explain." Sarah took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to face the past. She began, her voice slow but steady. "Ethan and I started dating about 3 months before he died. By then, he'd already broken up with Elena. But it wasn't Elena who abandoned him. It was Ethan who betrayed her. He cheated on her with me, and when Elena found out, she left him immediately. Ethan was devastated, not because he lost Elena, but because he knew he'd messed up. He drank uncontrollably, and that night, he drove drunk and crashed. It was all his fault, not Elena's." Alexander sat motionless as if turned to stone. Sarah's words struck him like hammer blows, shattering the wall of belief he'd built over 5 years. He shook his head, his voice raspy. "No, that can't be. I saw Elena's message in Ethan's phone. She wrote, 'Don't look for me anymore. We're done.' She clearly abandoned him." Sarah gave a bitter, pained smile. She replied, "Yes, she sent that. But do you know why? Because she caught Ethan and me together. I was there, Alexander. I saw Elena standing at Ethan's apartment door, her face pale as a ghost, then walking away without a word. Ethan ran after her, but she didn't turn back. He came back to me, crying, saying he regretted it, that he didn't want to lose Elena. But it was too late. Elena wasn't the traitor. Ethan betrayed her. Alexander felt the world collapse beneath him. He remembered the times he'd berated Elena, the insults he'd hurled at her, calling her a gold digger and a schemer. He recalled her eyes at the family party when he'd publicly humiliated her, and her cryptic words before their wedding. "You think you know everything about me? Then go ahead and hold on to that hatred." Now he realized she hadn't lied. She'd simply stayed silent, letting him drown in his own blindness. His hands clenched, nails digging into his palms until they drew blood. He asked, his voice choked, "Why didn't you say this sooner? Why let me live with this misunderstanding for all these years?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes red with tears. "Because I felt guilty. I was the one who came between Ethan and Elena. After he died, I didn't have the courage to face anyone, not even you. But today, seeing you here, I knew I had to tell the truth. Elena didn't deserve how you treated her. She's innocent." Alexander didn't respond. He turned away, staring at Ethan's grave, feeling suffocated by his own pain and regret. He'd been wrong, utterly wrong. Everything he'd done to Elena, the coldness, the humiliation, driving her out after Margaret's death, had been based on a horrific misunderstanding. He remembered her final note. "I'll set you free. Please live well." At the time, he'd thought it was her last act of pretense, but now he understood. It was the goodbye of someone who'd endured too much. He stood, his legs trembling, and looked at Sarah one last time. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face, then turned and walked away, leaving Alexander alone with the storm in his heart. He stood there under the gray autumn sky, feeling the fragments of his old beliefs crumble away. He'd misjudged Elena, treated her mercilessly all this time, and now she was gone from his life. He was stunned, not just by the truth, but by the realization that this awakening had come too late to mend what he'd destroyed. Chapter 7. The male lead searches for and pursues the female lead. After his encounter with Sarah at the cemetery, Alexander returned to the night mansion in a state of turmoil. The vast house, once a place where he felt power and security, now stood as an empty shell. He stepped into the living room, where Margaret's laughter once echoed, and sank into an armchair, his eyes staring blankly into the void. Memories of Elena flooded back like a tidal wave, but this time, they weren't distorted by hatred. They were clear, real, and agonizing. He recalled the mornings she quietly prepared breakfast, even though he'd always rejected it with biting sarcasm. He remembered her sitting by Margaret's side, gently reading or storytelling, her warm brown eyes radiating a sincerity he'd once dismissed as fake. He thought of the nights she hid in her studio, her emotion-filled paintings that he'd mocked, now appearing as whispers of the pain she'd concealed. And then he remembered his own cruelty, the insults he'd flung at her, the contempt in his gaze, and the day he drove her out after Margaret's death. Each memory stabbed into his chest, deeper than the pain of losing Ethan or his grandmother. Alexander shot to his feet, his hands trembling. He couldn't bear it any longer. The truth Sarah revealed had shattered the wall of hatred he'd built, leaving behind a void of regret and a desperate need to make amends. He whispered to himself, "I have to find her. I have to apologize." But Elena had vanished completely. She left no trace after departing the mansion. No phone number, no address, not a single clue. Alexander embarked on a frantic search for her, a fervor he hadn't anticipated. He hired private investigators, combed through every document related to her, even reached out to old acquaintances from her days teaching street children to paint. But it was all futile. Elena had dissolved into thin air, leaving no footprint behind. After 2 months of fruitless searching, Alexander was on the brink of despair. He sat in his office, gazing at the note she'd left. "I'll set you free. Please live well." Those words, once a cold farewell in his eyes, now stood as a reminder of her sacrifice. She'd chosen to leave to grant him freedom, though he didn't deserve it. He clutched the paper, his heart aching, and resolved to try one last time. He remembered her love for painting and wondered if she'd sought a place to pursue that passion. A faint lead emerged when an investigator reported a free art class for impoverished children in a small coastal town called Haven Cove, over 300 miles from the city. The teacher was a young woman named Lena, with no last name, but the description matched Elena: soft brown hair, warm brown eyes, and a gentle way with the kids. Alexander didn't hesitate. He drove through the night, heedless of the pouring rain, clinging to the hope that this time he'd find her. Haven Cove was a tranquil little town by the sea, with white wooden houses, gravel paths, and the steady rhythm of waves crashing against the shore. When Alexander arrived at dawn, the air was still misty, but he didn't pause to rest. He headed straight to the community center, an old building with a red-tiled roof, where the art class was held. From a distance, he saw her, Elena, dressed in a simple gray sweater, standing among the children, holding a paintbrush and smiling softly as she guided them. She was thinner than before, her long hair loosely tied back, but her eyes still shone, though tinged with a hint of melancholy. Alexander stood frozen, his heart pounding. She was still beautiful, still gentle as he remembered, but now he saw her through different eyes, no longer with hatred, only regret and a longing to make things right. He stepped forward, but when Elena looked up and saw him, the smile vanished from her lips. Her eyes turned cold, and she looked away, resuming her instructions to the children as if he didn't exist. "Elena," he called, his voice hoarse. She didn't respond, merely gesturing for the kids to keep painting. Alexander approached closer, but she said icily, "You shouldn't be here. I don't want to see you." He stopped, feeling as if he'd been doused with cold water. But he didn't give up. He spoke, his voice earnest. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've learned the truth about Ethan, about what I did to you. I'm sorry, Elena. I came to make amends." Elena turned, a rare flash of anger in her eyes. She replied, her tone firm. "Make amends? You think an apology can erase what you did? You humiliated me, threw me out, called me a gold digger in front of everyone. I don't need your apology. I've rebuilt my life here, and you have no place in it." Alexander's heart tightened, but he didn't leave. He countered, "We're still not divorced. I'm still legally your husband. I have a right to be here." Elena gave a bitter, hollow laugh. "Legally your husband? You never treated me as your wife. Don't use that title to force me. I want nothing more to do with you." She turned away, but Alexander refused to give up. He began appearing regularly in Haven Cove, not to pressure her, but to prove he'd changed. He rented a small house nearby, joined community activities, and quietly observed Elena's new life. She lived simply in a modest apartment above a bakery, spending her days teaching art and caring for the children. She was no longer the resigned woman from the night mansion. She was strong, independent, and seemed to have rediscovered the light in her eyes. But Alexander wasn't the only one noticing her. One day he saw Lucas Carter, a kind young teacher in town, with tousled black hair and a warm smile. Lucas often visited Elena's class, bringing juice for the kids or fixing the old chairs in the room. He looked at Elena with gentle eyes, clearly fond of her, and she responded with a friendliness she'd never shown Alexander. The sight ignited a wild jealousy in Alexander. He realized he didn't just want to apologize. He wanted her back, wanted a chance to make up for everything. But every time he tried to approach her, Elena rebuffed him coldly. Once, when he brought flowers to the class, she said bluntly, "Stop bothering me. I don't need flowers and I don't need you. Lucas is a good man, and he doesn't hurt me like you did." Her words hit Alexander like a punch to the face. He saw Lucas standing beside her, laughing with the kids, and felt an unfamiliar fear that he might have truly lost her forever. But instead of lashing out, he resolved to change. He started volunteering at the art class. Despite being so clumsy, he once spilled a box of paint on himself. The children roared with laughter, and for the first time, Elena gave a faint smile as she glanced at him. A small one, but enough to spark hope in his heart. Alexander didn't stop trying. He learned to do small things he'd never done before, fixing bikes for the kids, repainting the classroom walls, even attempting a clumsy painting to give Elena. He was no longer the cold CEO in an expensive suit. He became an ordinary man, willing to humble himself to prove he'd changed. Yet Elena kept her distance. She couldn't forget the wounds he'd inflicted, and Lucas, with his sincerity and gentleness, was slowly carving a place in her heart. Alexander knew he faced a tough battle, but he wouldn't give up. He whispered to himself each night, "I won't give up on her. Never." His pursuit of Elena had only just begun, but this time he didn't rely on power or arrogance. He used his heart, something he'd locked away for years. Are you still following the story? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other meaningful stories. Chapter 8. Emotional Climax. Elena in Danger. The town of Haven Cove basked in the tranquil air of a late summer afternoon. The sky was a clear blue, dotted with a few lazily drifting white clouds, and the steady sound of waves crashing in the distance played like a soothing lullaby. Elena stood outside the community center, holding a box of paints, smiling as she watched the children run and play on the nearby grass. After more than a year in this town, she had found peace in this simple life, teaching art, caring for the kids, and slowly healing the wounds Alexander had left in her heart. Alexander remained in town, steadfastly pursuing her despite her persistent distance. He was no longer the cold, arrogant man he once was. Now he wore casual shirts with rolled-up sleeves, often appearing at her art classes as a volunteer. He clumsily fixed chairs, joked with the children, and sometimes stole glances at Elena with eyes full of regret and hope. She couldn't deny he'd changed, but her heart remained guarded, unwilling to let him back in. Lucas Carter, the young teacher from town, stayed a close companion to Elena. He brought warmth and safety she craved, and though he never said it outright, his eyes always shone with deep affection for her. Alexander noticed, and every time he saw Lucas chatting warmly with Elena, a burning jealousy flared within him. Yet he didn't force her. He knew he had to prove himself through actions, not words. That afternoon, Elena was guiding the children in an outdoor painting session near the narrow road leading into town. A 6-year-old boy named Tommy, with curly hair and a mischievous smile, ran off to retrieve a ball that had rolled onto the street. Elena looked up and saw him step carelessly into the road, oblivious to a delivery truck barreling toward him from around a curve. The engine roared, and time seemed to slow in her eyes. "Tommy!" Elena screamed, dropping her paintbrush. Without a second's hesitation, she sprinted into the road, shoving the boy aside just as the truck was mere meters away. Tommy tumbled safely onto the grass, but Elena couldn't dodge in time. The truck screeched to a halt, tires squealing piercingly, but it still struck her, sending her crashing to the pavement. Her body rolled a few times, blood seeping from wounds on her leg and head, and she lost consciousness instantly. Alexander, standing not far away, witnessed it all. He shouted her name, his voice breaking with panic. "Elena!" Without thinking, he dashed into the road as the truck still lurched forward. The driver slammed the brakes again in a panic, but the truck's tail swung out, hurtling toward Elena's motionless form. Alexander didn't hesitate. He leapt forward, using all his strength to drag her out of the vehicle's path. But he couldn't fully escape. The truck's tail slammed into his leg, knocking him down as he clutched Elena tightly. Pain surged through his body, but he didn't let go, their blood mingling on the asphalt. The children's screams and the townspeople's shouts filled the air. Lucas raced over from the classroom, his face pale as he took in the scene. He yelled for help while the truck driver leapt out of the cab, trembling and apologizing profusely. The townsfolk quickly gathered, calling for an ambulance and rushing both Elena and Alexander to the nearest hospital. Tommy, scraped but safe, sobbed in his mother's arms, repeatedly calling Elena's name. At the hospital, tension hung thickly. Elena was wheeled into the emergency room with injuries to her head and left leg, while Alexander suffered a fractured femur and severe blood loss. The doctors worked urgently, and after hours of strain, both were moved to recovery. Elena woke first, her head spinning and body aching. But her first words upon opening her eyes were, "Tommy, is Tommy okay?" The nurse smiled gently. "He's fine thanks to you, but the man who saved you is in the next room. He's badly hurt." Elena froze as the memory of the accident rushed back. She recalled Alexander's shout, the sensation of being pulled, and then darkness. She whispered, "Alexander." Lucas entered the room at that moment, his face etched with worry. He took her hand, his voice trembling. "Elena, are you okay? I was so scared I'd lose you." Elena nodded weakly, but her gaze drifted toward the door, toward where Alexander lay. Lucas saw it, and his heart clenched. He knew she needed time, but he also sensed his feelings stood at a crossroads. Alexander awoke hours later as the fiery sunset streamed through his hospital window. His mind was foggy, but the throbbing pain in his leg reminded him of the moment he'd rushed to save Elena. He looked around, seeing crutches by the bed and bandages wrapped tightly around his leg. The door opened and Elena appeared, wheeled in by a nurse despite the doctor's advice to rest. They stared at each other in silence, the air heavy yet charged with emotion. Elena spoke first, her voice soft but clear. "Why did you do that? You could have died." Alexander gave a faint smile, his face pale from blood loss. "If you died, I couldn't live either. You left once, I couldn't lose you again." Elena lowered her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. She remembered the agonizing months of their marriage, his insults, his coldness, but also his efforts in Haven Cove, his transformation, and his reckless act just now. She whispered, "You hurt me so much. I don't know if I can forgive you." Alexander reached out, grasping her hand despite the pain each movement caused. He looked into her eyes, his voice choked. "It was only after you left that I realized I can't live without you. I know I don't deserve it, but please forgive me. Don't leave me again. I'll spend my life making it up to you." Elena faltered, emotions surging within her like ocean waves. She realized that, despite trying to bury her feelings for him, her heart still stirred when he risked his life for her. She didn't reply, but her hand tightened around his, tears falling ceaselessly, a sign that her resolve had softened. Lucas stood outside the door, witnessing it all. He turned away silently, his eyes red but a faint smile on his lips. He knew he couldn't hold on to Elena when her heart leaned elsewhere. Before leaving the hospital, he stopped by her room, placed a bouquet of violets on the table, and whispered, "I'm glad you found happiness, Elena. Wishing you all the best." Then he walked out, leaving her to follow her heart's choice. In the hospital room, Alexander and Elena sat together, saying nothing more. But their hands remained clasped, a silent promise to move past their history and step into a new future. The story's climax wasn't just the accident. It was the moment they rediscovered each other on the edge of life and death, where true love was tested and triumphed. Chapter 9. Falling in Love Again, Fulfillment. Autumn in Haven Cove brought refreshing breezes, carrying the salty scent of the sea and the vibrant golden hues of maple leaves. 2 months after the harrowing accident, Alexander had nearly fully recovered, though his leg still needed time to regain its strength. Elena, too, had returned to her art classes, despite occasional pain in her left leg from overexertion. But the greatest change wasn't physical. It was in their hearts. Old wounds were gradually healing, making way for a new beginning. In the weeks following their hospital discharge, Alexander didn't rush Elena to make a decision. He knew he'd caused her too much pain, and though his reckless act of saving her had proven his sincerity, he wanted her to open her heart willingly. He stayed in Haven Cove, living in a small house near the community center, and continued volunteering at her art classes. He learned patience, a virtue he'd never embraced during his years of hatred and arrogance. He brought coffee for Elena on early mornings, helped the kids clean up after class, and sometimes just sat quietly watching her paint, saying nothing, but his eyes full of tenderness and hope. Elena wrestled with a storm of emotions within herself. She couldn't deny that her heart stirred again when she saw Alexander risk his life for her, or when he'd said in the hospital, "It was only after you left that I realized I can't live without you." But memories of the painful months of their first marriage lingered, like shadows she hadn't fully banished. She feared that opening her heart again might lead to more hurt. Yet each time she saw Alexander, no longer the cold CEO in an expensive suit, but a simple, clumsy, and sincere man, she felt the walls around her heart crumbling. One afternoon, as a fiery sunset bathed Haven Cove's beach in red, Elena decided to confront Alexander. She found him at the pier, where he often sat alone after teaching. He stood there, sleeves rolled up, gazing at the ocean with a pensive air. She approached, her voice soft but resolute. "Alexander, we need to talk." He turned, his deep blue eyes lighting up at the sight of her, though tinged with a hint of worry. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit on the wooden bench beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the waves and the breeze. Finally, Elena spoke. "I've thought a lot about what you've done, from coming here to saving me. I know you've changed, but I'm still scared. I'm afraid that if I give you a chance, things will go back to how they were." Alexander clenched his hands, taking a deep breath to steady his emotions. He looked into her eyes, his voice low but earnest. "Elena, I don't blame you if you can't forgive me. I was wrong. Wrong to let foolish hatred blind me. Wrong to treat you like an enemy. I once thought you were fake, but now I know you're the most genuine person I've ever met. I'm not promising you the world, but I promise to spend my life making amends, loving you and protecting you. If you give me a chance, I swear I'll never make you cry again." His words were like a warm breeze, sweeping through the dark corners of Elena's heart. She lowered her head, tears streaming down, but this time not from pain, because she felt his sincerity. She remembered Margaret's words when she was alive, insisting Alexander wasn't a bad person, just blinded by pain. She recalled the moment he'd rushed to save her, heedless of his own life, and she realized that, despite trying to bury her feelings, she still loved him, a steadfast love that had endured past wounds. Elena looked up, a faint smile on her lips, her voice trembling. "I'm not promising it'll be easy to forgive everything, but I'm willing to give us a chance. Let's start over, Alexander. Not like before, but a new beginning, with real love." Alexander froze as if he couldn't believe his ears. He took her hand, squeezing it tightly, and for the first time since they'd reunited, he smiled. A true smile, free of arrogance or coldness. He whispered, "Thank you, Elena. I won't let you down." They started anew, not rushing, but taking it step by step, like two people learning to love again. Alexander returned to the night mansion to handle business, but frequently came back to Haven Cove to be with Elena. They walked along the beach together, talked about small things, and slowly built a relationship based on trust and respect. Elena opened up more, sharing her old dreams and the paintings she wanted to create. Alexander listened, no longer doubting, only cherishing the woman who transformed his life. A year later, they held a small ceremony in Haven Cove, not the lavish wedding of their first marriage, but a new vow between two hearts that had found each other again. Elena wore a simple white dress, standing beside Alexander on the beach, with the townsfolk and her art class children as witnesses. As they exchanged vows, Alexander held her hand, his voice choked with emotion. "I once misjudged you because of foolish hatred, but from today, I vow to spend my life making amends, protecting you, and loving you with all I have." Elena smiled, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. "I vow to stand by you too, not for anyone else, but because I believe in our love." The ceremony ended with a modest beachside celebration, filled with the children's laughter and the glow of a bonfire under the night sky. Alexander and Elena sat together, hand in hand, gazing at the moonlit ocean, feeling they'd found each other after a long, painful journey. To heal the past and create a shared legacy, they established a charity in Margaret's name, the Margaret Knight Foundation, to provide free art classes for underprivileged children nationwide. They started in Haven Cove, expanding the community center into a small art school where Elena taught and Alexander provided financial and organizational support. The children's paintings, bursting with color and dreams, were displayed in charity exhibitions, bringing joy to both them and the community. One evening, standing in the new classroom watching the kids paint with enthusiasm, Elena turned to Alexander and whispered, "This is what I have always dreamed of, bringing art to those who need it most. Thank you for doing this with me." Alexander pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead softly. "No, thank you for giving me the chance to be a better man." They stood there bathed in the classroom's warm golden light, feeling the past had been healed, and the future ahead was a canvas they'd paint together, full of color, love, and hope. When you love, don't let misunderstandings and prejudices cloud your heart. Don't rush to judge someone, for sometimes you're pushing away the one who loves you most sincerely. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.